record button on the bottom?
I did. I found the record button. Um, so it's like anyway. Um, so so good evening. My name is Mike Pavek, and I'm going to be talking to everybody about trying to start interpreting a company's financial statements and trying to figure out when you're looking at a potential employer, how to assess their financial health and trying to get a feel for that. One of the hard parts when you're looking at doing your job search, you're looking at a lot of different companies, and it's sometimes hard to discern them. It's hard to really know where they sit. In the same way that when a company is looking at candidates to employ, and they're trying to discern who's the good candidate and who's not. When you're looking for a job, you're also trying to discern, what's a good company, what's a company that's struggling, and kind of being able to figure out whether you want to actually work for this company. So we talk a lot about culture, and that's really important, but a company's financial health is also important because the financial health will drive sometimes a lot of the culture or change the culture. So just a big disclaimer, I'm not a financial analyst. I'm actually a product manager, so I'm just a boy standing in front of a girl, So take this with a grain of salt, but also if any of you have anything that you'd like to contribute or things that you've seen and a piece of advice that you have, please feel free to speak up along the way. This isn't a presentation as much as a discussion. Okay, so one of the big things is just what kind of information can I find out about a company? And that answer is very different on whether it's a public company or a private company. And we'll talk in a little bit about kind of the differences and then the strategies you have to take. But some of the big things, especially for public companies, I can find out by just reading one form called the Form 10K alone. It shows things like the org structure. So one of the challenges with this is just understanding how is a company laid out. What is the org, what are different segments, what does a segment mean? International, national, how many employees does it employ? How is it distributed across the country? You can find out a lot about just how a company is laid out just by going through some of these financial documents. And we're gonna do a case example here later on. Risk factors. So what are the big concerns that the company has? So when we're building a strategy, like say something called new product innovation, or new product introduction, one of the big things you're looking at is just balancing that risk. New product innovation and introductions are just as much about balancing risk as it is about being creative, and coming up with new ideas, being innovative. And so companies deal with risk all the time, and they tailor their strategy a lot around just facing and addressing some of those risk factors. The next one is executive officers. So usually you can go to a company website, you might be able to find out something about the executive officers, and usually also on the financial forms you'll be able to find out a little bit more, including ages, sometimes their tenure with the company. It gives you an idea of what the things you're looking at. Business strategy in a very loose way, you'll find a general bit about their business strategy. What kind of markets are they pursuing? What is their competitive differentiation that they're looking at? Some of these other areas. It's not the in-depth, detailed one, but it gives you enough to kind of go into a conversation with that employer, having an idea of the direction that they're pointing going forward. Financial performance, how are they doing? Are their sales increasing? Are their revenues increasing? Is their profit increasing? All these become really, really big deals. And you can see a multi-year trend on that. So what's the trend line look like? And then lastly, a little bit about competitive analysis, a little bit about what are their main competitors that they're looking at, what kind of competitors they're looking at, and how does that company see itself in the market. So in the chat, you'll see some other comments, like Patrick just shared some things about financial documents that you find for public companies as well as for nonprofits. So today we're going to be talking about particularly a 10K, but there's going to be a lot of other ones too. Okay, so question, where do I find this information? So public companies are great because they're public, and you can actually just go to their investor relations website and you can download all these different forms, whether they're talking about Form 10K, an 8K, a quarterly earnings report, shareholders letters. Heck, you can listen to, in some cases, you can see the transcripts of the quarterly earnings reports. So you can find a lot of information. That's kind of one of the nice things when you're in the job search mode of taking a look at public companies, because you can really, if you take the time to analyze, you can really get a good feel for where that company is sitting on a big picture. Private companies are a lot trickier because by their nature, they're private. They don't have to share the same amount of information. There are some exceptions to that, but in general, you aren't going to be able to find a lot of the financial statements from a private company. That's actually one of the advantages of, if you're a private company, of being a private company. The people that they generally will share this with are potential investors, and that's about it. It stays kind of close hold. Sometimes you can get things through back channels, but for the most part, it's not going to be available to you. So therefore, if it's a private company, you have to look, find other ways. So kind of we took at like open source intel. So things like news articles, okay? So if it's a company that's making waves, one example might be a company called Magic Leap, which was doing augmented reality. In those cases, you're going to see a lot of information about some of these companies. If it's a small startup that hasn't made it big and hasn't popped up on people's radar, sometimes there's not going to be a whole lot of news articles directly on the company, but there might be a lot of news articles on the market itself. So if you're looking at, say, data visualization market or artificial intelligence market, there's a lot of information on that industry or in that segment, and you might be able to find some about that company. There's a good chance you might be able to find something about that company's competitors, which kind of indirectly points you to, understanding where that company itself fits in. You could do, I wrote some other stuff in as far as doing your own market size and share and analysis. Let me see here. I'm getting oops, sorry about that. Okay, there we go. Sometimes you can do, if you've done a size and share analysis, that's one option. Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. And then the last one is sometimes just understanding the size of a private company by going to things like their LinkedIn site, seeing the number of employees they have, and then kind of adding on to that a little bit, because there's a certain number of employees that aren't on LinkedIn. So those are some ways of where to find some of this information. Okay, so I find information, and so what? How do I leverage this? Actually, before we go to that, let's take a look at one of the examples first. So let's see here. I'm going to do this. I'm going to switch over my share to, there we go. All right. So what I did was I pulled up Best Buy as an example. So this is a 10K. If you've never seen one, this is what it looks like. There's other financial forms too, but this is the most comprehensive one. This is an annual report that you have to, if you're a public company, that you have to file with the SEC. So you can find several years worth of this. And why does that matter? So markets change and things flux and wither. So if you know that, like, let's talk about the retail industry, for example. If you know that Amazon came in and started hitting the retail industry hard on online sales in, say, the mid-2000s or the late 2000s, you can actually go back and pull up some of these documents from a couple years ago and see how the company's strategy has changed, and then be able to adjust and tailor your message to those companies accordingly. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of walk you through that. Okay, so table of contents, this is, and we'll go through a couple key areas on this as we go through, but this kind of gives you an idea of what's on it. And generally, this is fairly consistent across all companies, especially some of these big things you see in part one. Well, actually, I would look at it, for the most part, this is consistent across most companies. This is fairly standardized form, slight differences based on the industry and the market, but this will give you the big pieces. Okay. So let's just jump down into this one. Okay, so the first part, part one, covers a basic business description. And you know, when you're brand new, especially when you're getting out of the military, even the business description is very, very helpful, because you won't necessarily understand if this is a consulting company, if this is retail, if this is automotive, you know, what is that really defined as? So also what you start to see is kind of what are those core values that company has. So let's take a look in terms of description of businesses. So a description of business is important because it's how that company describes itself. Okay, because we may have a certain impression of that company, but this actually states specifically how that company views itself. So we are, in this case, Best Buy says, we are driven by our purpose to enrich lives through technology. Okay, and what's interesting is if you go back a couple years and take a look at previous descriptions, that may have changed as companies start to pivot and change. Before, they might have said, we are retailers of consumer electronics, for example. And so once you see that change, you start to know, okay, this is a strategic shift, that a pivot that that company is doing. So I may fit in there, or I may not. All right. The next piece is segments and geographic areas. Okay. So when we're talking about segments, we're just talking about a way to kind of divide the business. When there's business segments, there's a whole bunch of definitions, but ultimately what you're looking at is how do I task organize? And so in this case, they have two big reportable segments, which is domestic and international. And then they will always kind of go into more details as far as what they define as domestic and international. So in this case, for Best Buy's case, their international segment is actually consists of just Canada and Mexico. So if you really look, then you're still talking about all of North America. For us as MTS Systems, you know, we talk about North America, and then we talk about the rest of the world. So each company will divide up their domestic and international businesses a little bit differently. You can also find out information on key acquisitions. And so key acquisitions matter a lot, and you can find out more later on in the form. But key acquisitions matter because what a company does and why they do acquisitions is generally to round themselves out in areas that they might or might not have exposure to. So for example, Best Buy, when we think of Best Buy, you're thinking primarily a big box retailer, physical stores that sell consumer electronics and appliances. That's kind of what they've been most known for. Now, if you look at, in this case, they've expanded out into a couple different areas, and that these are primarily health service related. So you've got CST, or critical signal technologies, as well as biosensics. So that gives you an idea that they're trying to diversify into the health service technology area. So the next part goes, so this next part, in terms of Best Buy, this is useful. It just breaks down how do they categorize their retail areas. So they do it in computing and mobile phones, consumer electronics, appliances, entertainment services, and others. And so why does that matter is because you might say, hey, you're from the Army. What do you know about retail? And you might say, hey, I'm not an expert on retail, but I do know supply chain logistics. I am passionate about computing and phones, as well as consumer electronics, and have been since I was a kid because I was a geek. I was a geek before there was a Geek Squad. So there's different ways to take advantage of being able to pivot into a company, even if their initial blush is you're military. What do you have that can relate with us? How can you relate? So when you're looking at this, the big question, one of the questions you're working through is, how can I relate better with both the position, the company, and the industry, even if I may not have direct experience in that? Because frankly, whenever you're leaving from the military, there's a lot of cases where we don't have a direct experience in almost any of these areas. So we have to kind of find ways to apply our experience and skills indirectly. All right, I'm not going to go into that stuff, but I do want to talk about IPs for a second. So IPs, somewhat in retail, but certainly definitely when you're looking at a manufacturing company, intellectual properties, patents, copyrights, trademarks are all really big deals because you can assess a company on how innovative they have been and how innovative they're being. We could have a whole conversation about how to find out more information on patents and some of these other things. But the bottom line is what you're really caring about is that that company is continuing to push in terms of innovation, or if they're a more mature company, they're continuing to protect their position and doing a defender strategy. We hear a lot about startups. We hear a lot about all that dynamic, fast-moving, industry. But it's also important of how does a mature company, defend its territory, defend its segment, and then expand incrementally on that. And when you look at what we've done in the military, we've done both. Okay. Next, competition. So competitors matter in the same way that how does a company view itself? Who does it view as its competitors? Because that's what when disruption happens is when I view myself in a certain way, I view my competitors as a certain way, and then somebody slips in the middle. So in this case for Best Buy, they're talking about their competitors are primarily multi-channel retailers, e-commerce businesses, technology service providers, et cetera. Now, if you look at this particular one kind of jumps at you, e-commerce businesses, about 10 years ago, a lot of these companies, heck, 5 years ago, in some cases, just before the COVID-19, a lot of companies didn't even think about e-commerce. So a lot of companies are shifting into that area that haven't been. They're doing a digital transformation that they haven't necessarily done in the past, especially when you're looking at small businesses trying to figure that out. So there's something to take a look at. If that company is now viewing their competitors in an area that they haven't viewed before, in e-commerce businesses, they haven't considered that a threat before, but now they consider it. It tells you an idea, either one, they got disrupted a little bit, or two, they're trying to get ahead of being disrupted or prevent themselves from being disrupted. Either way, it's an opportunity for you to come in because it's probably new territory that they haven't talked about before. Okay, we're not going to talk environmental right now, but we all care and love for the environment, yes. The next piece is number of employees. So sometimes we have a hard time scoping the scale of a company in the same way that the company has a hard time scoping the scale of the military. Okay. It was an interesting conversation. I was talking about how the Army's 1.2 million soldiers, and we have 4-star generals. And one of my coworkers pulled up his phone. He says, "Well, Walmart has 2.2 million, so they're twice as big as the Army. So there, how you like that?" It just gives you an idea of the size of different companies. So in this case, Best Buy is at 125,000. Of course, that's distributed over a lot of different locations. But the bigger the company, the more we'll have in terms of issues of bureaucracy, agility, and these types of things to consider. All right, let's talk about risk, because we all love talking about risk. So the risk factors are those big things that the company is really trying to address and answer. Because the reason why is because, one, the company wants to stay in business, but two, that the shareholders and the board are generally asking these questions and pushing the company leadership on how are you addressing these risks. So let's take a look at it, just a couple, just to get an idea. So Best Buy says some of their big risks are we face strong competition from multi-channel retailers. Okay, that's not a big surprise. You're fighting, if you're Best Buy, you got to go up against Amazon, you go up against Target, you go up against all the direct sales channels, that companies that have direct websites, sales websites, lots of different competition in the retail space, which is why it's always so dynamic. Our strategy is to expand into new products, services, and technologies. So how does a retailer move into particularly new services? And so there's always new products coming out, but how do they move into new services? In Best Buy's case, they've done Geek Squad. Now they're doing some in-home consulting as well as some of the health technology. Other companies like Target has shifted. They did an acquisition of the Shift company to allow them to do same-day delivery. So that gives you some ideas there. So we were just talking about services. So our focus on services as a strategic priority exposes us to certain risks. So this one's particularly talking about moving into the health healthcare area and all the liability risks that can come with that, as well as going into in-home consulting. So for any of these companies, when they're making shifts, okay, they're going to be looking at moving into areas that they haven't been familiar with. Okay, so that's where an outsider's perspective can help them out, because you might have a lot of people that have worked retail, big box, physical store retail, but they haven't talked about health services. They haven't talked about in-home consulting. So if you're a new candidate, you may be able to take advantage of that. Say, actually, I've experience thinking about this because I've done A, B, and C. Okay, we kind of talked about subject to risks associated with transformation. And then we've also seen about supply chain, key vendors, all these other types of risks. So these are just some examples. We're not going to go through all of that, but it's just some examples when you're looking through that. And so when you are looking through these risks and when you're doing the process of analyzing a company, a good strategy to do is then to reach out into your network or expand your network to somebody within that industry, or ideally within that company, but just in that industry in general, and say, what do you think about this? What does this mean to you? And how can I, be able to help address that risk for the company? Next, executive officers. So this is just kind of interesting stuff to know. Why it kind of matters is actually not so much the ages of the people, but especially the years with the company. It gives you kind of an idea of what's kind of going on behind the scenes, and where are they trying to find change, and where are they strong at. So in this case, the CEO of Best Buy is a woman by the name of Corey Berry. She's a St. Benedict's graduate, so go St. John, St. Ben's. And she's been there for 20 years. She has moved through a bunch of different positions. But it's just kind of good information to know, and kind of helps you have an idea. Because a lot of times when you're talking in an interview, you'll hear the hiring managers or the person that's interviewing you saying comments about the CEO or the CTO or these types of people. So it gives you an idea, and it gives you the ability to quickly say, yeah, I understand that this is their background. So what do you think about this? So you're looking for ways to follow on questions and build your conversation. All right. Next, stock performance. Okay, stock market, we all know the stock market's a bit fickle. Sometimes it's a good predictor, other times it's totally wrong. But what you're looking at is kind of overall trend line. So in this case, what you see is S&P as well as a retail group, and then where Best Buy's stock's been moving. Why that matters is that, one, it's about available cash at hand and investments, but it also tells you where they are in terms of a transformation cycle. So you kind of see, well, this is a fairly small point of view because this is just from 2015 to 2020, but this gives you an idea that you can go back and do kind of a bigger stock analysis and kind of see those trends, those inflection points where things go good, and those inflection points where they've had a struggle a little bit. All right, financial data. Okay, again, we're not going to get into all the numbers and stuff, just some big things to look for when you're taking a look at financial data. Okay, revenue. What is revenue? So if you're coming straight out of the military, you really haven't necessarily dealt with revenue a whole lot. So generally, revenue is the money that I bring in, but that is different for each industry. If I'm in retail, when I bring in the money is when somebody buys that phone and pays me, and I charge right there. I get revenue. If I'm a manufacturer for a big system like what we do at MTS, we have a multi-million-dollar system that I'll pay you 50% on order, I'll pay you another 50% on delivery. So if it's a 2-year delivery cycle, that revenue is now split up amongst two years. Okay, so revenue works differently for different companies, but ultimately what revenue does is allows the company to do its investment, it allows them to pay their bills and pay their employees, all these different things. So revenue is really, really critical, but it's measured differently by different companies. So it's tough to consider. Net earnings from continuing operations. So net earnings, obviously, overall is a really, really important area because it tells you kind of what you're making at the end of the day. A couple different other things. How has been your sales growth? So in this case, if you look at, you see sales growth changes over the different years. And so the questions ask why, how did this happen? What did you change? How are you going to continue if it's a positive trend? How are you going to change if it's been a negative? gross profit rates. So gross profit is it's just kind of how much you're making in terms of percentages. Why some of this matters is if that is changing, but particularly, has it been consistent? Has it been growing? Has it been decreasing? Okay. If gross profit has been going down, yet the revenue has stayed about same, that means the costs are going up. And what that'll tell you is that company's going to be very conscious about cutting costs because costs are getting out of control. Likewise, if you see gross profit increasing a whole lot and the revenue hasn't changed, then you know that they found a whole lot of ways to be more efficient, which means that now there's going to be some extra cash to be able to pursue an innovation project or something like that going forward. Selling, so G&A, so general and administrative expenses, that's just kind of like your overhead. If you're on salary, for example, and you're not charging your time to a particular project, you generally fall under G&A, okay? G&A matters because it's kind of how companies account for things, particularly project-related companies. We could talk debt to asset ratio, but no, we're not going to talk that. All right, so that's some of the financials. And then lastly is the business strategy. So as military, we're all familiar with strategy at some different level. Depending on our background, we may be more familiar with high-level strategy than others. But why this is important, though, is it tells you really the direction that the company is trying to pursue over a course of years, and then that's really where you want to fit in. You want to fit in not just with your experiences, but you want to be a match with the direction that that company is going moving forward. So you can take a second to take a look. We continue to make progress on building the new blue strategy. So therefore, you have to kind of go back and say, what does building the new blue strategy mean? But it gives you an idea of kind of their big focuses. Okay, and the last one, this one's kind of new. It's starting to just pop up into Form 10Ks now, the impact of COVID-19. So it's kind of just interesting to see what companies have been reacting well, what companies have struggled with that. They're not going to say we struggled, but you can kind of read between the lines. And most importantly, with COVID-19, you can see how vulnerable that company or that industry is to COVID-19. There's been a lot of companies that have struggled with COVID-19, but there's also been some companies that have done really, really well in during COVID-19. And so the question is, when things start opening up, will they continue to do well? Have they made changes that are going to be permanent, or is it just happen to be that the clock pendulum swung in their direction? And so that gives you an idea of thinking, because COVID-19 is not going to last forever. What happens when things settle down? And things start to go back to the new normal. Where is this company going to be positioned? Tariffs, yeah, tariffs affect us, especially if you're dealing with China. Okay, let me switch back over to the slides. So before I go, does anybody have any questions on like a 10K itself? Any of you guys used a 10K while you're pursuing a company?
I think this is all new, good info, Mike.
I'm guessing that answer is nope. And that's okay. That's why we do these things. But there's some others. Actually, let me switch over here. Hang on. Actually, let me do this here. So when you go, what does an investor's relations webpage look like? So these are some of the things that you're going to see here. Quarterly results. So quarterly results. So that Form 10K sounds really great because there's a ton of information, right? But depending on when the company files it, that may be outdated information. That's literally yesterday's news, but it may be 6 months old already. So in Best Buy's case, they tend to end their fiscal year, I think, around February. In other cases, they end their fiscal year in, say, September. So each company has a different schedule. So just be aware of how fresh that information is. So what is really fresh will be the quarterly results. And where, especially if you go, let's see, I'm going to try to see if it shows the transcript here. In some cases, what they do is an earnings call. So every quarter, a public company will do an earnings call, and that's literally a giant teleconference where they will read a lot of statements. But the CEO and the CFO, so the Chief Financial Officer, will talk about kind of what has happened in the last quarter and where they're moving forward to. So if you work closely with the CEOs or you've worked around the CEOs, you'll see that they have to spend a lot of time just going through all these quarterly reports and reporting process. So it could be quite painful and quite difficult. So anyways, good stuff to take a look at. All right, let's go back to wherever the heck we were. Okay, so again, all this is great information to know, but what do I do with it? Okay, so here's a couple things to take a look at. One, it helps give you an idea of where this role fits into their overall strategy. So say, because I'm from a product management background, say if they're looking at new product introduction, they want to create a new service, they want to create a new physical thing, they want to create, some sort of new financial packaging, for example. It gives you an idea of where that fits in there, how high it's going to be in the priority, which means how much funding and support you'll get as a manager. It'll also tell you how many sets of eyes will you have on you as you're doing your work. Okay, and so if this is a high priority, high visibility project, you can talk about, I've done a lot of high visibility projects. I've reported to a 4-star general. I've been the exercise planner for say the Korea exercises, or I was one of the ones who was working with Test and Experimentation Command. So I've done a lot of high visibility projects. Or if it's not high in that priority, you could talk about how you've been really able to do a lot of things without a lot of resources. I've had funding cuts, I've had personnel cuts, I've had tight timelines, and this is what I've done in that situation. So it kind of helps you figure out what kind of angle you need to come in at. It gives you an idea of what is keeping that manager up at night, which is a great question to ask. What is your stress? What is your number one priority that you are dealing with, and how can this position help with that? So it kind of gives you an idea, even going into that conversation. Knowing this information really helps you tailor your value proposition. Okay, so value propositions, we would like to think, well, we have one elevator speech for every company, which means that we've just made one generic elevator speech that's all about us, but not necessarily how it relates to you. So really, this helps us tailor that value proposition to make sure that it's meeting the needs of the company that you're going to be talking with. It may help you with key skills and attributes going in there. And it may even help you, give you an idea of what you have to do with a 30, 60, 90-day plan. Generally, your boss is coming up, or the employer will be coming up with a 30, 60, 90-day plan, but you may already have ideas. Hey, here's what I want to accomplish in the next 30 days, because I know based off of listening to the last quarterly report that you're trying to achieve this within the next 6 months. And so this is how I can help you with that. And lastly, it talks about building follow-on questions. So going into any interview, going into any meeting and engagement, you want to have a ton of questions. If you're just reading through that 10K, you're going to have a lot of questions that you're going to want to follow up with. So this will give you an idea of how to have that conversation. You never want to be the person to say, when they say, do you have any questions? Say, nope. You want to be able to have those questions and really show that you've thought things through. But more importantly, you're trying to find out, kind of thinking as if you're in that company, that position already, what do I need to know to really do my job? And that's kind of how you help make yourself stick out. Okay, well, we already talked about the real world example, so I think that's all I've got. Yeah, so that's all the formal part of my presentation. What questions or thoughts or comments do you guys have?
Could you go over that again? I was late.
Nope.
You are funny. I do have just one comment. In addition to going to a company's website and pulling off some of that information, your local library is an excellent resource. And oftentimes you need to go to the bigger libraries like the Southdale, whatever they call it, the larger libraries, and they will have a business or reference librarian there whose job it is to help you find this information. So let them do their jobs and let them help you. That's what they're there for. And they can be a wealth of information. There are a number of websites out there. Dun & Bradstreet, for example, has quite a bit of information. I just pulled up Best Buy while we were chatting. But they do charge for some of their information, as well as some of the other websites out there, but you can get that free at the library. So I would encourage you to, you know, get assistance in your research through the business or reference librarians, and it can save you a lot of work.
And I'll give a follow-on to that. For any time you go to the library, I learned the best phrase with the reference librarian is, how can I learn about this, or where can I look this up? Not go look this up for me, just to let you know. I didn't use the latter. I've always used the former, and it works great.
So these are great tips. So as you're doing your job search, you know, so one of the things is take advantage of things like this meeting. For example, say I am pursuing a job at Target, or I am pursuing a job at this. I would like to just be able to actually just talk about this, because I've just read went through their 10K. And right now my head's swimming, and I need to help process that. That, you know, it is fine. That is a great breakout session discussion to have, because really that will help prepare you for every meeting that you have. And I guarantee you, if you go into these conversations with the recruiter, hiring manager, supervisors, blah, blah, all the different people, and really showing that you kind of are really getting your mind around their business, you know, and their industry, especially coming out of the military, that really helps relieve some of their concerns. One recruiter I spoke with talked about, you know, from a recruiting standpoint and from a hiring standpoint, it's really about the risk that you're having to accept. So the less experience, the greater the risk of that candidate, because it's extremely expensive to hire somebody who's not a good fit. And so you as a candidate coming up are trying to say, this is why I am not just a safe or the right bet, I'm also a safe bet. You know, you don't have to worry, you can sleep easy at night because I'm already addressing your concerns. So you want to kind of demonstrate that during this process. Okay, any other comments or questions for me?
I just have one, Mike. You've used this before, and so can you just quickly summarize what the impact was when you're in your interview? Like, what did they like go, that's none of our business, or did they like really engage with it? Did it help your interview?
Yeah, so every time when I've done that research and been able to bring that up, it has a really, really strong positive effect on that. Because it addresses the biggest concern of, you're coming outside of our industry, you know, oh, you do get it. You do understand what we're worried about. And that's been the feedback that I've gotten when I was going through the interview process time and time again, is that they might have been concerned about the military background, but you were able to really show that you understood the business, and they would like to have another interview, or they'd like to have a follow-on conversation. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording here.